there's no other way to say it, Russia has defeated NATO. We threw hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons, all manner of mercenaries in Ukraine, unlimited political and financial support for Zelensky and the regime in Kiev for 3 years now, and the war is basically lost. It's not defeatist to say that; it is realistic, and that's a catastrophic thing. The future of Europe is at stake. The future of NATO is at stake. I mean.
Hey guys, you're watching Capital Cosm. My name is Danny, and today's guest is the one and only Doomberg, the Green Chicken. Doomberg, thank you so much for coming back on the show, my friend.
Danny, always a pleasure. Congrats on the great success you've had. Really been fun to watch your momentum grow.
Oh, I appreciate it, Doomberg. It's always a pleasure having you on, especially your insights and wisdom. So let's just dive right in. For you right now, we were just alluding to off camera that there's so much stuff to talk about, but to you, if you had to pick one thing, what is most topical for you right now?
Well, I think obviously we have to start with the meeting that just wrapped up in Saudi Arabia between senior diplomats of the United States and Russia. I think this will ultimately, when the history of 2025 is written, I think a sort of rapprochement between the United States and Russia will probably end up going down as the single most important event to have transpired, assuming one is reached and some other event out of left field doesn't sort of change the entire global order. But we are truly living through tectonic plate shifting times. I think the security conference last week was pretty amazing, actually, to watch from a distance. J.D. Vance's speech in particular, I think really came as a shock to many Europeans, although I'm not sure why it should. The thing that has been amazing to watch is Donald Trump basically doing every single thing he committed to doing in his Agenda 47 videos that he started putting out all the way back in 2023. So anybody who has followed the man closely can't be too surprised at what they're seeing. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take any of these directions, but it feels like a whirlwind, which is what we called Trump this morning in a piece that we just published.
Yeah, it is significant what's going on over there in Saudi Arabia between the two countries, by way of Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, and our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. One, because Russia and the United States haven't spoken in, 3 years now, or close to 3 years since the start of the Ukraine war?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration has catastrophically dropped the ball on all things Russia and the war in Ukraine. And we've come to grow quite hard internally about our view of what transpired and who is to blame and how history will treat the key actors of the time. It was never possible to defeat the world's foremost nuclear superpower in a kinetic war without being willing to resort to nuclear weapons. And it was clear that the United States was never willing to do that, let alone get involved directly with troops, at least in an official capacity. And so I think it's very clear that Trump wants to undo all of this, and the Europeans are in disarray, shock, anger, especially the British. I think there's an underlying theme here of a broader breakup of the U.S.-British relationship. I think there's no love lost between Trump and the British. I think he blames them for the Russiagate fiasco, perhaps correctly. And I see Starmer as Keir Starmer, the Sir Keir Starmer, I should say, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was out yesterday saying that the path for Ukraine to NATO is irreversible and committing to send British troops, all of which, of course, will never happen. But it's just amazing to see the crack up between what was supposed to be sort of an unbreakable bond. And one wonders where we go from here. I do think, we've been pondering things internally, and sometimes we build models and we don't write about it. But there's a real chance that the U.S. pulls out of NATO. There's a real chance that the entire edifice of the post-World War II geopolitical structure comes tumbling down, and how those pieces get put back together and the friction of that transition is pretty amazing. And I think almost nobody's ready for it. Gautam was out with a great piece this morning covering some of this. He's an author on Substack, who we like to read, an old friend. And so, we're truly living through enormously consequential times. I think whatever your views on Donald Trump, and he is certainly a polarizing figure, nobody will accuse him of not going for broke, I guess, all in on his vision for the country, and the rest of us are just sort of strapped in for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it with the fact that this is the end of the post World War II order. I think that's gone over many people's heads, but this is a significant breakthrough. Do we go as far as to see a potential U.S.-Russia alliance? But before we get into that, I want to just rewind a bit. So this meeting between Lavrov and Rubio is not to negotiate the peace settlement between the two countries. It's simply to set the stage for the meeting to come between Trump and Putin.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have again, some of our views are a little out there, and one of our internal expressions is a working model need not be true, it just need to work.
Right.
And one of our working models from the beginning of Trump's administration is he really has nothing tangible he could offer the Russians on the narrow subject of Ukraine. There's no set of compromises that the Russians would accept to end the war. I think they've made that point abundantly clear. They're winning the war, and so why would they compromise? And so one of the things we've pondered is whether Trump just needs to stall a bit and let the military situation evolve to a point where Russia is now satisfied with that particular question, and then they get about the task of reorienting the entire U.S.-Russian relationship. So one of the things that doesn't surprise us, for example, is one of the headlines coming out of the meeting today is that Putin and Trump are not going to meet next week, apparently. That the stage is not quite ready for them to meet. And I think we're seeing a bit of a stall. I think we'll also see concurrently an acceleration of Russia's military assertiveness, I guess. Putin, for all of the ways in which he is mischaracterized in the Western media, I think does genuinely want and has operated in a way to minimize Russian troop losses. And some of those restrictions may be lifted in the desire to sort of impose the solution that is satisfactory to the Russians via military means. There is no compromise. If you listen to what Sergei Lavrov said before he went to Saudi Arabia, like they're just not going to be territorial concessions. They've made that point very clear. And the fact that they're still meeting means that, at least in our view, the U.S. must have accepted this reality. It didn't strike me, as you correctly characterize it, as this being a stringent negotiating session where, neither side is happy, but a breakthrough result is achieved. This is more about undoing 4 years of zero relationship between the two countries and building back bit by bit some of the trust that is necessary for superpowers like Russia and the U.S. to coexist with some manner of peace between them. All this would have sounded like hearsay, just a few short months ago, especially here in the West. But it was always going to be this way. The objectives were unattainable. And what we're seeing on the part of the Europeans is truly amazing to watch. I mean, it's like everybody at the poker table knows exactly what cards they have, and they're going all in anyway. It's truly amazing. And, we'll have to watch and see how it ends.
Did you hear of Keir Starmer's comments about sending troops to Ukraine? He and the Europeans in general talking about a peacekeeping force in Ukraine by the tune of 100,000 troops, 40,000 of which would come from the UK. I mean, the UK has what, 100,000, standing military, standing man military, or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that just a bluff on the part of the UK and Europe as a whole?
I have no idea. So, in fact, we've looked into this question. I think you were referencing Keith Kellogg too, who may have been probing the Europeans to see how many troops they would be willing to send. He's one of the peace envoys on Trump's team. But Keir Starmer wrote this amazing editorial in the Telegraph, committing 25,000 troops, I thought was the number. But actually, we've done some analysis. Like, there's 75,000 troops in the British Army. The state of the British military is scandalous. Their aircraft carrier couldn't go to a NATO exercise because the propeller was broke. That there was a scandal in the UK about the living conditions of some of the army and the barracks they were living in. Roach infested and worn down and just this is not a country that can, without the support of the United States, project meaningful military power at great distances, especially against an incredibly well-armed, trained, and motivated foe who is in the middle of what they would characterize as an existential battle. And I don't know what he's doing. The hubris of it is stunning. It's like thinking you could run your steel industry on wind turbines and solar, except it's far more grave of a miscalculation because we're talking about war. And the Russians have been very clear on this. Another sort of thing that just amazes me is how few people in the West actually read what the Russians are saying. Now, what traditional Western media outlets rarely cover them, and so it's understandable. But if you truly want to understand what's going on, you kind of have to read both sides. And the Russians are making a very credible argument that the only legal way for peacekeepers to go somewhere is through a resolution of United Nations Security Council, and of course Russia holds a veto. So I don't know what they're smoking. They had this meeting in Paris that Macron hosted, and it broke apart with no real joint communique or commitment for troops. That there's very little support for this in reality, and the political support for these players is at all-time lows. So I was looking at this picture that was on the Zero Hedge article of all of the European leaders sitting at this round table. I'm sure you've seen it, but if you just go from person to person, you have Rutte, the head of NATO, unelected, appointed. You have van der Leyen appointed. Keir Starmer's approval ratings in the low 20s. Macron's approval ratings in the teens. Olaf Scholz's approval rating in the teens, about to be voted out of office, on Sunday. And they're sitting around trying to figure out how to scuttle the negotiations, presumably between Russia and the U.S., and scratching up whatever support they think they could give Ukraine in the last throes of what is a lost war. It truly is mind-blowing to see. I mean, at some point, as we've said, when it comes to energy, in the battle between platitudes and physics is undefeated. I mean, the U.S. is required for Europe to project military power. The British military is in a scandalously terrible shape, and yet this fundamental axiom of analysis is lost on the British political elite and much of the European political establishment. I really don't have words to describe what I'm seeing. I'm so confused by it, I guess is the word I would use, is confused. I have no idea what they're thinking they can do absent U.S. support, which is clearly gone. Like Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. Again, whatever you think of Trump, I think it's important to understand, or at least try to understand, his mindset, and he has made it 100% clear. He wants to get back to business. He wants Exxon back in Russia. He wants MasterCard and Schlumberger and Visa back in Russia. He wants energy prices down. He wants tariffs lifted. He wants peace between the great powers. He's even going to cut a deal with Xi Jinping, I think. A whole other thread we can pull on. This is where the current sitting president of the United States is going. By the way, broadly popular positions. I don't know anybody in the United States. Now, it could just be a statement of who I know and who I interact with, but like, not many people want to go to war over the Donbass over here. That seems like a Slovak civil war. Why do we need to get involved in such a thing? We've been surprised by the Biden administration's moves for the past 4 years, and frankly, unsurprised that Trump won the election, and unsurprised at the actions that he's taking. And so everyone else seems to know what's going on, except for the Europeans. And I should say, except for the subset of the European elite who are currently and temporarily in charge, because you're going to see a lot of them just get washed out of power in waves of electoral anger. And so that they're holding on to what is clearly a losing hand and then actually going all in again, it's just very confusing. I don't know. Happy to take any alternative views that you might have, but I sure can't explain it.
Yeah, I can't either. It's the only thing I can think of is just that they're delusional. I mean, when all hope is lost, I mean, you have nothing to cling to but false hope. So we'll see what happens.
Look, I mean, we've said this many times. One of the reasons that you should try really hard to not get into wars is you might lose them.
And that is true.
And by the way, one of the hardest things to do is lose a war, to accept defeat, to take the L. Having tried many things in my life, some of them successful, some of them not. I can think of past initiatives, professional initiatives, where you work really, really hard on something and it's just not going to pay off. And at some point, you have to take the L. You got to stop throwing good money after bad. You got to stop throwing good time after bad.
Is the U.S. going to be perceived as taking the L in this case?
How could we not? I mean, we engaged in a proxy war with Russia, and we lost both the military war and more importantly, I think, even if one can use those words, we lost the sanctions war, which we have been pounding the table on for years. The sanctions were designed to fail, and they have failed. And so, yeah, like there's no other way to say it. Russia has defeated NATO. We threw hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons, all manner of mercenaries in Ukraine, unlimited political and financial support for Zelensky and the regime in Kiev for 3 years now. And the war is basically lost. It's not defeatist to say that. It is realistic. And that's a catastrophic thing. The future of Europe is at stake. The future of NATO is at stake. I mean, if you compare the security conference here compared to the one 3 years ago when the war is about to start, it's a profoundly different attitude. That's what happens when you lose wars. Losing wars is one of the hardest things to do. And it's been very, very difficult on the people of Ukraine who've suffered the most, who should feel betrayed, who should be angry. All of those things are totally legitimate feelings on their part. Losing a war is hard, very hard.
What about the Europeans and Zelensky? You just mentioned him not being invited to these talks. What's the rationale there? Is it just, I mean, what's the way I'm reading it is just that they're not primary stakeholders in this discussion. It just tells you that the primary stakeholder of this war throughout the entirety of it has been the United States. Otherwise, Zelensky would have been invited. Otherwise, the Europeans would have been invited. But it seems like Russia or Putin is mainly interested in talking to the U.S. and not wasting his time with anyone else.
That's probably true, but I don't think it explains what we're seeing. What is probably going on instead is that they're not really talking about Ukraine yet. And so there's just no need for Ukraine to be at the table. I think this is the beginning of a very long and slow restoration, normalization, you might even say, of relations between Russia and the US, which are a necessary precondition for meaningful negotiations and a settlement to the Ukraine war. And back to my earlier sort of mental model, consistent with the military needs of the Russians and the political needs of Trump. And so Ukraine is not at the table because this meeting in Saudi Arabia was not primarily, if even tangentially, necessarily about Ukraine. And so one of the pieces of evidence for that is Lavrov's statements before he flew to Saudi Arabia, and yet the meeting still occurred. And so that's our primary view there. There's much for Russia and the US to normalize: diplomatic relationships, economic relationships, the sanctions policy, the future of the dollar, how international trade will be handled going forward, the situation in the Middle East, Iran, China. One of the fundamental flaws of this entire episode, one of the sort of fundamental flawed assumptions of the Biden administration, is that Russia was not a global power and Russia was weak. Russia is every bit a global superpower. And the assumption that so many have made over the centuries is that, just a little prodding and the whole edifice collapses. Well, that's just not what happened. And so again, like, the sanctions were designed to destroy the Russian economy and accelerate the end of the war. Neither has happened. How could you characterize the sanctions war as anything but a loss? And so you have to be realistic. I think Trump is realistic. Trump has had business success and he's had business failures. He's, used the bankruptcy system brilliantly, as he characterizes it. That's a euphemism for he's had big projects fail, and he knows how to walk away from them. And so I think that's just where we are.
Yeah, did you hear about this invitation from Trump from Putin to Trump to the Victory Day parade coming up later in the year? And
So,
and also he also invited Xi Jinping as well. So very, very interesting combination there if it does occur. Do you believe that Trump will attend the Victory Day parade?
so I saw in Trump's public pronunciation that there had been mutual invitations extended to visit each other's countries. Not sure that I've seen officially that it would coincide with Victory Day, which is, I believe, May 9th. And Trump did make reference to the Russian sacrifices in World War II. So it's possible. I think it would be a very odd picture for the sitting US president to be standing in Moscow with hostilities still going on in Ukraine.
Right.
And I can't see how hostilities in Ukraine wrap up before Victory Day. And even then, whether a sitting US president would want to be taking part in what would amount to a celebration of victory over NATO. So I don't know that Trump will be in Moscow on Victory Day. I would fade that, but if he does show up, then our view of the world is even more scrambled than you and I are talking today, which to many people listening will sound like we're crazy. So yeah, I can't see it. Honestly, I can't see it.
Yeah, you mentioned China a few minutes back, so let's go ahead and pivot over to China. But before we do that, one more thing on Russia. This is kind of like a neocon talking point or strategy that I've heard from the likes of Pompeo and so forth. And that is, yes, we should disengage from Russia because the real enemy or the real objective should be China. So there's this talking point that we should try to distance Russia from China. Is that what's going on here? Is this part of do you see as part of a ploy to break up the BRICS alliance or the Russo-Sino alliance in the process and thereby kind of isolating China? And then number two, would something like that even work? You know, would Russia and Putin, you know, really put too much credence on a 4-year term with Trump, given the fact that they run the risk of getting another hostile administration in a few years' time?
I think the greatest loss of all of this adventure in Ukraine is the fact that we have pushed Russia and China, I think, irreversibly close together, which has always been something American foreign policy and Western foreign policy has worked very hard to prevent. And I agree with the second part of your characterization, which is I don't think there's anything that the West or the US could do to drive a wedge between Russia and China. And I'm not sure that Trump is interested in doing that. You know, you could put us in the category of isolationists, you know, proudly so. And we're certainly not in the neocon camp, and we're not fans of the neocons. They do exist, by the way, and they're a very powerful force in American culture to this day. And Trump needs to be careful and thoughtful with how he tangles with them. But like when China took back Hong Kong, nothing in my life changed, right? Like China is a giant power. China's a superpower. China, by definition, probably has spheres of influence. And one of the ways the world remains in relative balance and peace is through respecting spheres of influence of the great powers. And to the extent that we got away from that, as Secretary Rubio correctly characterized it as an anomaly, the unipolar moment was an anomaly, an unnatural one. And the way in which we regress back to an equilibrium of multipolarity is a dangerous transition, and one which hopefully we can do so peacefully. And so, like, there's very few things that I, you know, as an American, would be supportive of my military-aged children being drafted into a war. Primarily, the defense of the homeland. That would kind of be so the minimum table stakes necessary for the vast majority of Americans to support U.S. troops, U.S. blood and treasure on some foreign adventure. And this is forever thus, of course, you know, and isolationism rises and falls in popularity, but I just think that it's called the Department of Defense, not the Department of Proactive Offense. And nobody is going to invade the U.S. Do we have geopolitical interests? Sure. Very, very few of them are worth going to war over. And certainly even fewer of those are worth going to nuclear war over. And so I would say the best defense is a good defense, right? I mean, so, there's going to be a deal struck with China, I suspect. I don't think we're going to go to war with China over Taiwan. Hopefully, I mean, as important as Taiwan is to the people of Taiwan, for example, or others in the region, it's not super critical to the average American. The average American couldn't find Taiwan on a map, and probably doesn't know it used to be called Formosa. I mean, so like these are not things that we would deploy the military over. The military should be defending the homeland, and the U.S. is very defensible. It is blessed with enormous resources and institutions and so on, and we should get about the business of taking care of business on the homeland. I applaud Trump's focus on the fentanyl issue, for example, and securing the borders. Having crossed many a border myself and stood in long lines, that others were just allowed to walk across it unimpeded always seemed like a huge scandal and frankly, a double standard. And so I think, Trump is a business person at heart, and I think he wants to get back to business.
Is the attack on Canada, let's call it, is that an indirect attack on the UK?
It's funny, we didn't plant that question, but that's exactly how we've been modeling it internally. I think, and look, we have many Canadian friends, and I would say they are deeply and authentically angry at America right now. I think the hockey game of a few days ago was more than a metaphor. And I think that there was significant damage done to the U.S.-Canada relationship by Trump. And that relationship is way more important than many of the other relationships that the U.S. has with any country in Europe, even the U.K. It's the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. There's much in common between the two countries, but Canada is a proud country, and I think to denigrate Canadian patriotism in the way that Trump has done is a mistake. I think he's doing it to rattle the British and to distract the British, because I think he has deep disdain for the British and British intelligence. I mean, look, in his mind, the British intelligence tried to take him out in 15 and 16 and probably played a role in 2020, and certainly were campaigning very hard against him in 2024. And I think Trump does have a bit of a track record of being vindictive. And so, yeah, I think when he refers to the Prime Minister of Canada as the Governor of Canada and Canada as the 51st state, it's more of a verbal assault on the British than it's meant to be anything Canadian specific. But it's totally understandable that Canada has internalized Trump's behavior, his words and his behavior, in a deeply negative way. And so that is kind of an unfortunate sort of highlight of Trump's first month in office, if we would call it that.
And how does it affect the UK? How do these attacks on Canada affect the UK?
Well, I mean, Canada and the UK still have a very strong historic tie, and at risk of insulting my friends in Canada, I think that the British would kind of view Canada as a key element of its sphere of influence. And so, there's the official head of state of Canada is still the Governor General, which is appointed by King Charles. So there's a long and complex relationship between Canada and the UK, and then the interrelationship between those two countries and the United States. And so I think since Trump is focusing on the Western Hemisphere, that's what it looks like to us, and Canada is a key part of the Western Hemisphere, I think sending a message to the British about the U.S.'s stance towards Canada is more about the U.S.'s stance towards the British than it is about Canada.
Understood. Now, a few moments ago, you referenced a potential deal that could be struck between Trump and China. Can you go into detail into what that is?
Well, I mean, you just have to, let's take a step back. Trump is actually quite easy to understand in some ways, and of course a very complex man in others. But he usually tells you what he's thinking if you know how to hear what he's saying. And one of the most important comments we heard last week, in our view, was a throwaway comment during one of his many press gaggles while he's signing executive orders. Or maybe this one was the one with Elon Musk standing beside him. I forget which, because there's so many, but he said he wanted to get with Russia and China, with Putin and Xi Jinping, and to cut their collective military budgets in half. You don't do that if you're gearing up to go to war with China over Taiwan. And by the way, this solves Russia's main problem with the war in Ukraine, which is a broader security question for them. So, like, we're trying to ponder how all of these threads could be tied. One of them is the U.S. pulls out of NATO. That solves Russia's security threat, quote unquote, on its European front. Trump is very interested in cutting budget spending. I think the U.S. fiscal situation is manageable, but in crisis. The Pentagon is rife with fraud and waste. Well, all federal government agencies are ripe with fraud and waste. And I think in a world where China makes all of our military equipment anyway, we're not going to go to war with them. Why are we spending all this money when we have deficits we need to finance and, well, cut and then finance the deficits, and maturing short-term treasuries that need to be rolled over at higher interest rates, and U.S. running a deficit of 6.4% of GDP, which is unsustainable when you have 120% debt to GDP on the books. So we're seeing sort of a grand plan play out where the U.S. becomes more isolationist, focuses on the Western Hemisphere. Russia gets its security needs taken care of. Europe is hung out to dry. There's no other way to say it. And China and Russia and the U.S. go back to sort of a world of multipolarity. The word has different meanings to each of the three powers, but broadly speaking, I think that seems to be the direction that Trump wants to head. Whether he can get there. By the way, there's going to be huge internal domestic opposition to this, even in the Republican Party. Some would say especially within the Republican Party. It's going to be a dangerous road. Not clear how it's going to all play out, but I think that's the direction Trump has been highlighting. He wants to do business. He wants to cut the government. He wants to unleash American manufacturing. He wants to achieve peace. How do you do that unless you cut a grand bargain with the two other large powers on the planet?
Yeah, definitely. This was an idea that was brought to me by one of my commenters on my live stream the other day. And he was basically drawing a parallel to how we got into the Ukraine war and what could potentially be the next war. And that is, if you recall, back in 2021, Biden unceremoniously pulled us out of Afghanistan. Now, it was the entire thing was a big screw up, but he did pull us out of Afghanistan. He did pull us out of a war, only to get us into a war with Ukraine a few months later down the line. So in hindsight, it appeared that pullout wasn't because of, Biden all of a sudden had a knack for wanting to create a more peaceful anti-war world. It was in preparation for the next war to come in Ukraine. Now, with this Ukraine war seemingly potentially coming to an end, could it be that this is just a setup for another war down the line, namely Iran, which a number of Trump allies seem to be Iran hawks?
I would say I hope not, but who knows? It would seem inconsistent with the rest of the moves that Trump is making. There is that wing, the same wing, that was very bullish to get involved in Ukraine in 2021, 2022, as you accurately described, is now pivoting. So the Lindsey Graham wing of the Washington establishment, I wouldn't characterize Lindsey Graham as a Republican. I would characterize him as a charter member of Team DC. That wing has long been anxious to get into a war with Iran. There's no other way to say it. Again, Not something that particularly excites me. I would hope that that's not what would happen. I think such a war would be catastrophic. All wars are catastrophic. Like, who won the war in Afghanistan? Nobody did. Who won the war in Ukraine? I mean, well, aside from Russia, but did Russia really win? I mean, they've suffered greatly. They've lost lots of troops. They've had, all manner of things imposed upon them, sanctions and seizing of their foreign assets and so on. Nobody wins in a war, just there's degrees of losing. And so and by the way, tied to this is the whole question of Israel. And we wrote a piece that was controversial at the time that I think has aged quite well, where we mentioned just how vulnerable Israel is. And if Iran is in possession of, ballistic missile technology that is able to penetrate Israeli air defense systems, not many targets need to be hit to really make that country unlivable. You don't need nuclear weapons to knock Israel out of a war. You just need to hit their half a dozen power plants and half a dozen desalination plants. And everybody knows where they are, and they're very difficult to guard. So I think there's a bit of a détente and a bit of a mutually assured destruction situation going on. That's what we argued in that piece. We got a lot of pushback on that piece. But in writing that piece, we predicted that, in fact, Israel would not attack Iranian oil and gas infrastructure. And in the 5 or 6 months since we wrote that piece, they haven't. And so that's consistent with our working model. Back to what I said earlier, it need not be true, it just need to work. So I would hope that we're not pulling out of Ukraine just to gear up to fight another war in a faraway place with distant supply chains that nobody in the region, save a few, really want. And so, but one of the lessons I hope we learn from the Ukraine war is that supply chains matter. And Russia is a larger country. The war's on its border. The path to its military-industrial complex is a short one, railroads and highways, as opposed to boats and planes. And that's why they won the war. And the logistics of fighting a war in Iran from here using predominantly Chinese weapons just doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do. But what do I know? I'm not in government.
Yeah. So for the last few moments of this interview here, I want to pivot over to energy, which is what you're best known for, Doomberg. What is your outlook for the energy markets, given everything we've seen that's transpired under Trump over the last, 3 or 4 weeks? It feels like he's been around for 6 or 7 months now.
Yeah. Well, oil is being defended at $70 a barrel, right? Natural gas in Europe is trading like peace might be imminent. I note with interest that it's down 25% in the last 10 days. And so, Newcastle coal's at $100 a ton. The oil markets are very well supplied. Upside risk is geopolitics only, not geology. And not, the capital cycle or anything else. Literally the only thing keeping a bid under oil right now, aside from OPEC, is OPEC defending the floor of their targeted price range, is the prospect of a potential geopolitical event. And if we achieve a grand bargain, I think we're going to see prices go down significantly. And that's got to be on people's radars. And so we'll see. By the way, Trump has clearly stated that he wants lower energy prices. What better way than to strike a bargain with the grand superpowers and achieve peace? Look, it's no coincidence that Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. are by far the 3 largest oil producers in the world, and the 3 of them got together yesterday and today. So I think there's a deeper objective going on. Low energy prices are a necessary precondition to catalyze a manufacturing renaissance, which is Trump's clear and top priority. And betting against that desire seems like a sucker's trade from our perspective, especially when you look across the physical market. Crack spreads in the tank, coal selling for very cheap, natural gas in the U.S. elevated from the lows, but still very cheap. Natural gas in Europe, 30%, 25% off the recent highs. The market is starting to begin to price world peace. Yeah,
and one more thing, I want to also get your thoughts on gold. gold has been in the news lately. It's been in the news for over a year now, making new all-time highs. But there's this story with gold being emptied out of the LBMA from the Bank of England. A lot of people attribute it to the potentially coming tariffs to hit Canada and Mexico should a deal not be struck over the next few weeks now. But is there something more to it? Is there a grander reason as to why gold is getting a huge bid up and the LBMA is getting emptied out? South Korea is banning the purchase of or the sale of gold from different bullion stores and so forth. And then various banks in Europe are also, imposing some restrictions on gold purchases as well. What's your view on what's going on with gold?
Well, I mean, to put our conspiratorial cap back to what we talked about earlier, if the US-UK relationship is truly going through a crack up, one of the things you would expect to see is a flow of gold from London to New York, wouldn't you?
Interesting.
And so, again, one of the things about being in this business is over time you learn that the news is always wrong. Perhaps not wrong in explaining factually what's going on, but the reasons behind what's going on are almost always wrong. And you learn from history a decade later just how wrong everything was. And so we don't find it surprising. One of the reasons why we've been pondering just how deep the fissure between the US and the UK might actually be at the moment is the flow of gold from London to New York. The cover story of sanctions actually on the European Union doesn't really hold water. First of all, that's not something Trump can do unilaterally without Congress, I don't believe. The reason he could do the tariff stuff on Mexico and Canada without congressional consent was because it was wrapped in the fentanyl emergency. So he was able to declare an emergency, and I believe reciprocal tariffs are within the presidential purview, but outright tariffs on, blanket tariffs on EU that would cover gold seem a far-fetched idea today. And so that cover story never really added up in our mind. Look, we're not experts in why gold flows across various capitals and the nuances of the futures market and standing for delivery and rolling contracts and all that jazz. But if you just sort of squint your eyes a little bit and blur the world and then zoom out at a high level, gold being emptied out of London and filling up in New York is exactly the kind of thing that we would expect to see if the unbreakable bond was beginning to stress.
Between the US and the UK.
That's the unbreakable bond, yeah.
Well, this is why I'd like to encourage you guys to check out my good friends over at ITM Trading and to set up a call with them for, getting a good reading on how to maneuver in this, precious metals bull market that we find ourselves in. The prices are great, but then you also get a free strategy call, no commitment necessary. If you don't like the prices, you just simply don't have to buy. But at the very bare minimum, you get a free, call with an expert, and they get to walk you through all of your options on the table. So take advantage of the free call. Link to that is down below, or you can call the number as well. I think I have it somewhere on the screen here. So check them out. Doomberg, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. Anything else that you want to talk about that we seemingly didn't get to?
Anything that we didn't get to can be found at doomberg.com, where our full archive of some 350 articles is now available to paid subscribers. Danny, always a great conversation. Again, I'm proud to watch the success that you've been able to achieve both on Substack and on YouTube and your other endeavors. And it goes to show that high quality product and sweat equity leads to success. And so very happy to come on anytime you'll have us and enjoyed this conversation a lot.
I appreciate it, Doomberg. I'm just trying to catch up to you. That's all.
Come on in. The water's warm.
Yeah. Well, hey, guys, if you enjoyed this content, give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss an episode. Type "Go Doomberg Go" in the comment section if you agreed with Doomberg's analysis. If you think we were off the mark in any way, do let me know. I do read the comments. And then finally, as Doomberg alluded to, check us out on Substack, capitalcosm.substack.com, where you can get early and ad-free access to all of my videos, as well as uncensored access to my videos that warrant it. So with all that said, Doomberg, thank you so much for coming on. Guys, thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode. Bye, y'all.